In my response to the end of Eros, the Bittersweet, I really want to talk about the fine line between lover and beloved. I think it's interesting, especially with this book being written in the 80s. There is no talk of consent, really. And with desire, you don't really get a whole lot of consent, because it is something that comes without willingness. And you could say that you don't get consent from desire itself, to be even attacked with that feeling. And the fact that, she talks about it as lover and beloved, and not just two lovers mutually loving each other, is very interesting. So, and it comes along with unrequited feelings. I mean, you could still have desire and a lover and a beloved, and what comes between them, and maybe what comes between them is a lack of requitance. The fact that the beloved does not want the lover like the lover wants the beloved, and that brings a lot of interesting stuff. And we talked a lot about, in the last class, about the difference between beloved and lover, and then as soon as the beloved loves the lover back, then the beloved becomes the lover. And I think overall that's just very interesting. And I guess my question would be, where does consent come in with all of this, bringing it into 2020? Where is the line between those two? Overall, I love this book, and I can't wait to read The Agony of Eros.
Hello, welcome to week 4. Sorry, I just got a weird look. So I think it is safe to say that I did not like the Anne Carson, but that's just me. It's not that I don't like her writing. It's not that I don't like the theories. I just didn't like it. So I think it's safe to finally say that. But going on. In our class discussion, we talked a lot about like fate and whether or not we can change our desire and things like that. And I really just wanted to touch base on that right now. So I believe that we will always fall victim to our desire. And we fall victim because that's what we're supposed to do. God put this person in our lives for a reason, for us to fall in love with, and they break your heart, or fall in love with and marry and live 50 years together. So I believe that that's really just, we're fate to do it. Whether or not you can change it is way beyond what I can think of, because I don't know. It's just, we're gonna do it. They're put in our lives for a reason, so I think like that. Yeah. I had more to say on that, but I don't remember, and I really just don't know what I was planning on saying. I don't really have any questions. I'm excited to read Agony of Eros because it's a really short book. And I've looked at the back cover and I've skimmed it now, and I think it's gonna be a good read. Yeah. That's what I've got today. Good luck.
Hello. I'd like to start this response video by asking a few questions, as I always do. If capitalism corrupts desire, what do the other economic systems do in relation to desire? What do these other systems do to allow desire in society to be uncorrupted? Is there a way to remedy or change capitalism as we know it to allow for desire to be rendered uncorrupted? With my questions out of the way, I'm looking forward to the discussions that come with this new text. I'm recording this before finishing the next readings, but I'm looking forward to the discussion on the new material. With discussion as lively as it has been, I feel like I've finally gotten my bearings in class discussion. I did not wake up on Tuesday about 15 minutes before class expecting to discuss the ideas of fate, destiny, and free will, or lack thereof. It was something that had me walking away from the class thinking hard about it. It also inspired some conversation between some of my friends, some interesting discourse between my roommate and I, and finally it turned out to lead to other lively discussions among my fraternity brothers. This also coming from a class discussion in a class about desire was rather eye-opening to me about just how much desire is influenced by external factors. Don't get me wrong, I had an idea that it wasn't all internal, but this puts into perspective just how much culture and society influence desire. That also leads me to wonder how much, if at all, we can influence our desire ourselves. Thinking on that idea for so long after class, I turned to those around me, outside of class, to discuss this idea. There sadly wasn't any conclusion that was reached with an answer to that question, but it did show me how personal such an idea can be to a person, and how much a person's personal experience can impact their interpretation of it. This has been me, Christopher, lying in the Yamcha blown up death pose for about 3 minutes after facing a Nappa main in Dragon Ball FighterZ. Thank you for your time, thank you for listening, and I hope you look forward to seeing where the discussion goes from here as much as I do, especially with the new book, and therefore even newer ideas being added to the discussion. Have a good one.
What's up? It's me, Aston, again, coming to you live from the place that I always am. So I thought it was interesting. How we had this really big discussion about Phaedrus's choice about essentially like Socrates or Lysias. I'm gonna say Lysias, even though it might not be that. It might be Lysias, because he's dead, so he can't do anything about it. And kind of like, what does this choice represent for Phaedrus? But I thought it was interesting, and kind of said a lot about the book itself and the way the book frames things, that Carson didn't really frame it as a choice at all. She was very like pro Socrates and very like, so this is why Socrates thinks Lysias doesn't know what he's talking about in any way, shape, or form. And this is also why Socrates thinks Lysias is too fond of the written word. I know he didn't phrase it like that, but like Socrates was like, hey, the written word sucks, and Lysias thinks it is cool, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. And Lysias wasn't really, I don't know if like there was a response ever given, but like Lysias, it's very much, Socrates' opinion is very much treated as like the conclusion. It's very like, Carson is very, very pro Socrates and very like treats it as obvious that Phaedrus chooses Socrates. I think it's revealing about classical tradition, because isn't Socrates' argument in here a defense of the status quo? It's not like the idea of a completely like stasis, like a love completely in stasis is healthy. But Socrates is still basically like, yeah, no, the system, it's actually good as it is. Um, which it isn't. Um, and then, like, so this upholding of the status quo, because also, like, speaking was the status quo and writing was not the status quo yet, I think says a lot about the Greek tradition and, like, especially, and also, like, Carson's treatment of the Greek tradition. I think that the treatment of the Greek concept of love, specifically, like, mostly love from the perspective of the lover, which is a position that we've talked about a lot, but also from the perspective of the beloved, so that would be Phaedrus here, I think, unless I'm forgetting something. But I think that the framing of both of those kinds of Greek love, and especially Socratic love, like Socrates talked about, that he was like, this is so much obviously better than Lysias, as universal. I think that's kind of a weakness of the book, because it would be one thing to talk about, like, this is very relevant for classical studies type thing, and it's another thing to be like, actually, this is what the entire concept of love is like forever. I kind of feel the same way about Byung-Chul Han's stuff, where he's kind of like, I'm going to make big claims about the world and not really specify what I'm actually talking about. But we're going to get into that next week, I assume. And then I'm almost at 5 minutes. So
One thing that I found really interesting about this book is how Anne Carson was able to seek something so, say, emotionally fueled as love and describe it so analytically. I think that comes from her Greek understanding. The Greeks were, being an early civilization, they studied a lot of nature and the body and emotions, and they looked at it like, for lack of a better description, like children. They didn't understand what it was, so it's hard to describe, but this book really summarized how we look at something and kind of take for granted the fact that it exists, and just by saying that desire is not, we don't desire it because we have it. Most people wouldn't think of that. They think that the pursuit of desire isn't actually desirable, but it is. And the idea that her book ended with a lot of ambiguity makes sense, because even you can analyze as much as you want the process of love or desire and how we cope with that, whether it's good or bad, and you just won't fully understand it. It's not, her book made it almost sound like love and desire and passion are bad, and sometimes they are. Sometimes they do cause us pain, but like she also said, they also give purpose and imagination to our lives. So the idea that they are a necessary evil in a way makes sense, and some choose to live with it and some choose to try to live without desire, and that's entirely their choice.
Hey, it's me. Back again. You know it. Class discussion, response videos. I'm Marissa. And I really enjoyed our discussion on Tuesday, especially about kind of the love triangle, or rather non love if you happen to be Lysias. Um, in terms of like who Phaedrus should pick and everything, but I think in terms of that, we talked tons about free will. And obviously that debate is still going on, and we could talk about that for a whole nother class period. But I think what's so interesting about this, and coming from it from another angle, is thinking about how the Greeks view love. And so just spends a lot of time, Carson spends a lot of time talking about how Eros is, of course, a god, and he shoots his arrow and you don't have control over that. And so much of the Greeks' fear and contemplation comes from this fear of not having control over Eros. But I think that's just kind of representative of the Greek culture compared to more American cultures. Well, we'll just say more modern culture, not necessarily American culture. I'm not surprised that the Greeks had a lot of issues with desire, because when you look at the setup of their culture, you see that the Greek gods, in the way that they had them and created them, is sort of a way to shift blame. So you already see that with Eros, that like, as soon as Eros shoots you with his arrow, like, you are not in control anymore. You didn't have control over who you like. And I mean, there's some truth in that, but there's always control over your actions. So they really feared the way that desire changed them. And if you don't have self-control, or you have plenty of gods to blame for your actions, I don't see why they wouldn't be afraid of that, if they feel that their own feelings are not something that they have in control over. Why wouldn't you be afraid? So Carson on page 149 makes it pretty clear that Lysias's non-lovers, their attempt to maintain self-control and control of the situation and be masters of themselves, is the word that's used there, is neither possible nor desirable, which is the same thing that Socrates says. And Carson, as we said, clearly is really on Socrates' side with this. Pretty, I don't know, dramatic or poetic. I don't want to say romantic. That seems like kind of a strong word in terms of what's actually going on in the situation. And in the book, a lot of the quotations she uses. So I think that speaks a lot into like why they would be so afraid, because obviously if self-control is terrible, then you're not going to be able to control yourself, kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that way. And then also kind of parallel related to that, just a couple pages later on page 154, it says, according to the traditional Greek attitude, change of self is loss of self. And so the reason why Eros is so difficult for them, like why they fear it so much, is because it changes them because they don't have any control. Kind of a big loop here. But I just think that's kind of silly. There's a Doctor Who quote, right up against Socrates. We're going to put a Doctor Who quote that I think just perfectly combats it. It says, we all change when you think about it. We're all different people all throughout our lives. And that's okay. You've got to keep moving, so long as you remember all the people you used to be. And so I think there's kind of two ways of looking at change. You either accept it and move on and come to terms with it in a healthy way, the Doctor Who quote, or you kind of sit there and try and fight it and have many existential crises about who you should love. Socrates. In that sort of way. And so honestly, I said in the chat the Greeks were weak. I feel like many of their problems here perhaps are self-created, and with an attitude or perspective adjustment, they may be able to find themselves freed of some of these worries and concerns. Obviously, it's really easy for me to sit there and say that because we have a different culture and a different perspective and a lot more learning about psychology and, the fact that people can change, that sort of thing. So easy for me to say, but I guess some more in-depth questions that come from these questions, these things that I brought up about the Greek gods and about change, which is more productive for life, sort of the Doctor Who attitude or the Socrates' attitude towards change. Probably depends on the person, who's to say. And then which makes for better writing, which I think is important when you think about the Carson quote, because Carson is clearly getting so much joy from analyzing these Greek thoughts that maybe if they had I don't want to say better, we will not assume that my perspective on life is better, a different perspective on life, she wouldn't have so much to analyze. So what makes for better writing, and kind of from that, does suffering make better art? So does having a lack of control in the case of the Greeks, does that make for better writing and for more interesting things to analyze? I think sort of in that same question, does suffering make better art? Like in terms of, there's been that huge debate about whether, mental disorders can make you a better artist. You think about how many people in history, famous artists of all kinds, suffered from all kinds of mental health issues. I'm not saying that's perfectly related, but in terms of that question, I think it could be pretty interesting to talk about. That's it for me this week. See you next week.